thank you for joining us for our panel discussion today. I know that there are probably a few people who may yet be walking in, but we have a panel who are really excited to share with you some of our ideas, and we're hoping that this is a discussion where you'll feel encouraged to ask questions and join in our dialogue. My name is Alice Walker. I work for Antenna International, and I'm the Digital Media Director for the Americas. Our session today is a panel discussion about the third spaces, our apps becoming the virtual orientation between museums and their visitors. And I'm joined by my illustrious colleagues here to my right, Allegra Burnette, who is the Creative Director for Digital Media at MoMA, Joe Baskerville, who's the Chief of Technology for Cogapp, Tim Svenonius, who is a producer of interpretive media at SFMOMA, Koven Smith, who is the principal of Kinetic Museums, and Keeli Shaw, who is an interpretation project manager at Local Projects. And we have our Twitter handles up here if you'd like to be tweeting today and including anyone in your messages. So for our panel discussion today, we are going to talk about the third spaces. I'm going to share with you our definition of third spaces, and then we're going to discuss a series of 5 questions. Each of our panelists will pose a question, place it in context for a minute or so. We'll discuss it amongst ourselves, and then we'll open up the floor for 1 or 2 questions approximately for the audience. Then we'll move to the next question. We've got 5 questions, so we'll do that in the better part of an hour, and we'll have some time at the end for your additional questions. So if we wanted to talk about third spaces, then we think it's important for us to share with you our general definition of what this is. Using the term third spaces makes an assumption that there's a first and a second space. So that first space we might generally think of as your personal space, what you do in your home, what you do with your device on your person. The second space then would be the space perhaps in the institution, what you're doing when you walk through the institution's doors, in the gallery, whether that's in an analog or a digital sense. And so then the premise is our museum apps and mobile devices, for instance, bridging and creating a space in between the two. What I'm sharing here is just an image that's split between 2005 and 2013. And the top, they're both actually from the inaugurations of the last 2 popes. So in 2005, you see a rapt audience, and in 2013, you see similarly a rapt audience, but completely engaged in the experience through their handheld devices, whether it's a phone, an iPod, an iPad. And so we all, every one of us, certainly has numerous multimedia devices. We know that people are using these every day to communicate, to capture their memories, to do their work for their calendar, et cetera. What we've also been seeing, though, is that the success for institutions to be able to integrate that regular use behavior with interpretation is not matched. At least for Antenna, what we see is in our sites where institutions have what we call a universal model, where the price for renting that on-site device is included in the price to walk through the door, that there's an 80 to 90% of take-up rate. So if you walk through a door, you've already paid for your ticket, and you have people greeting you to provide interpretation in any number of languages. People really want that interpretation. But it's a completely different story with downloads. The same information, even when it's free, for Antenna at least, we're finding that that's a lot closer to about 10%. And there are institutions like MoMA that completely buck that trend for many reasons. But what we can say at large is that there are barriers for entry. And so there are many different ways that we can think about what that mobile experience is providing. How can we deliver it? What are some of the successes that we've had as institutions? And maybe what are some of the pitfalls that we can also share? So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Allegra.
So one of the things that we've been thinking about at MoMA, we were in the process of switching from one of the wands, touch button audio ones to a more interactive device. And part of what we were asking ourselves is, how do we connect this experience that we're about to create in the museum with what we're doing online? At the time, we had a mobile website, apps, and a general museum website. What is this thing that we're adding into the mix, and how can we kind of connect the dots in terms of that experience? So we did a couple of things with that, one of which was observing how everybody takes photographs in the galleries all the time, and actually integrating that as part of this device and interactive experience. But then as part of that, because this is a device that we're handing out to you and then taking back at the end of your visit, how can we then give you those images? How can we give you a record of your experience in the way that you have like a souvenir postcard? How can we give you a souvenir of your visit? And so what we did is we created what we call My Path. And so if you add your email to the device before you hand it back, you get emailed a link back to MoMA.org, which you see in the lower left here. And it's basically everything that you've done as part of your experience, whether it's listening to an audio, reading some text about a work of art, or taking a photograph. Now, bookmarking and things like that have been around for a long time, but what I think we're finding is that just in these early stages, so this was launched in July, we're working on the public downloadable version that will be coming up very soon. Just don't hold me to a date, but within the next month or two. One of the things that we have learned is that people are really focused on the photo taking and this sort of personalization as a motivation for getting this path and going back online. So in thinking about that trigger between in-museum and online experiences, what we're finding so far, and this is again early stages, is that it's about some kind of a personal connection that makes them want to take that bridge between the in-museum and online. So I guess I just open it up to the panel to say, what are some of the experiences that you've had that have either worked or haven't worked in that regard? Take it away.
I think I'd be interested to know what people are using, how they're taking photos, and do you think they're gaining anything extra from adding to the creative output of what's going on?
Well, I think in observation of what we've seen people taking photographs, well, first it's actually very funny because they go, and especially when you have a family or group, they go and they all get their devices, and then they stand next to the desk, and then they start taking pictures of each other, and then they go off into the museum. It's like they haven't done anything. It's just, okay, we're documenting. So they're documenting basically everybody holding onto a device, essentially. So we have a lot of those photographs, which is kind of funny. But then you also realize, where are the kind of like photograph-oriented moments? Like, what are the photo opportunities around the museum, both in terms of experiences, but also, I think, what are the works of art that kind of trigger people? And so I think some of them are the obvious ones. There's lots of Starry Night, but some of them are less expected. And so I think that's one of the things that, in an anonymized way, we're going to start to try and get some information about, how are people experiences that? What can we learn from the experience within the museum based on this?
So it's quite an interesting analytics layer as well on top, in a way.
Yes. And so this data, and I should preface this by saying this is very early stages of what this could turn into. And so, like I look at the DMA dashboard, I get very jealous because this is like, the baby step. And so this is really your own personal path, and what I'd love to see is, what's an aggregate of everybody's personal path in a way that gives us useful information, but isn't, delving into people's personal information, obviously. And so what can we learn about the experiences that way? Yeah. Did you have a question? I think.
What people have downloaded or photographed on My Path. First, I love it. I wish I would have known I'm a member, and I was there more than the pre-show, and we all wish we had remembered to take pictures, because later when we were talking about it, we kept saying, that one.
Right. Well, and I think that's an interesting challenge with projects like this that we're finding, and I don't think we've figured it out, which is that, trying to get people to understand why it benefits them to add their email. And we tried to just do it in the beginning, and then at the end, and that wasn't enough. And so actually there's a trigger when you take your first picture to say, hey, if you add your email, you'll get the photographs. So a lot of it is about, getting people to understand what it is that you're offering them and why they might care about it. So I would say that's probably the biggest challenge in general with some of these projects is awareness and understanding, especially when you start to add, it's a few different features. It's not just one particular thing that you could, have the one-liner of like, this is how you do. So.
Did you have any special considerations about how you solicited people or invited them to add their email addresses? We found in other apps that sometimes there's a real barrier to entry because today people are experiencing this through devices that you're distributing. So do you think that there's any kind of fear about sharing that personal information, and how did you manage that?
Yeah, what we're giving you is a link to your own information. We did add in after the fact, later on, not initially, we did add an email sign up, which you can then opt out of. So we are trying to build up an email, audience out of this. That being said, it's a balance of trying to do it in a way that doesn't, we want more people to participate. So it's what's that balance of getting more information about our visitors, but also not driving them away. And one of the interesting things was there was a dip in the email path, and I thought it was connected with when we did the email sign up, but it was actually before, and it was more about a dip in the overall attendance at the museum. So trying to correlate what you see in traffic reports kind of against attendance is also important, so that you're looking at something and going, oh, well, this did not trigger the thing that we thought, but this other thing did. So.
Allegra, are you actually, it's interesting that because of this, you're starting to sort of discover what are kind of maybe the most popular objects or interesting paths that people are taking around the museum. As far as the connection to the online space, how is what you're learning from that influencing what you're doing on the web?
Yeah, and again, I feel like this is sort of nascent stages because what I imagine is that now the next version of MoMA.org is building out of this experience. So rather than, we did this site and then we added the mobile, now we've done this app and soon to have the public experience, and then growing the new version of the website kind of from that point of view. So you could easily think how you could branch off to other experiences and, you like this work, there's this other exhibition over here, or there's an interactive experience that we have that you might want to take a look at. So you could see how this can start to build into, discovery experiences, and I think that's what we're sort of aiming toward is like, you came and you had this visit, you had this sort of souvenir, how can we then trigger something else that's more of a discovery or another point of engagement beyond that? And, I don't think we have the answers yet. I think this is really just, again, taking an approach to say, rather than having this thing and this thing, let's see how those two things kind of come together and connect. And with the public version of the app, also thinking about that differently, because this notion of a My Path is something completely different, because this is about a physical museum visit. We know we're handing you the device. We know you're handing it back at the end of the visit. When you have your own device, we don't know whether you're in the museum. We can do geotagging and things, but we don't know. It's much less tied to a particular visit because you could be using it any time. So then this notion of a My Path becomes something a little bit broader. So I'll leave you that notion so that you'll download the update when it comes out.
So we're going to move to Joe.
Okay. Okay, so I was interested in talking about how we could offer up alternative methods of engagement. So we are good nowadays at layering a kind of metadata over the gallery of, interpretation on objects, access to collection data, that kind of thing, audio, video, multimedia. And I'd like to push that further and see what other potential there are. So I'm offering this up as a hypothesis of something that might be interesting to people, and this is a dummy experience where people are invited to gain extra insight into objects by drawing them, and by drawing them they They get further understanding of the object's shape and how the artist might have made things, and they also get to focus in and actually see the physical object a lot clearer, and then maybe this system would then share those drawings with people and you'd be able to connect it to them and see them. And I think it's just it's an own example project, but quite an interesting thing. But what I want to point out is the pitfalls around that. So you offer that up as an idea, a hypothesis, and then you have to really explore, like, from the audience, who would actually want to use this stuff, who is capable of using this stuff, how much would this cost, how much of this do you actually do, is this 10 steps too far, how do you find out that, where's the right level to pitch things? Because, making websites for so many years, you tend to build the most accessible layer first and then layer on top of that with progressive enhancement. And I'm suggesting that we should be doing similar things with these kinds of experiences. What is the core idea that we're trying to achieve? How can we achieve that to the most people? And what can we add on top that would actually engage people even more? Does that make sense? Okay, I'll carry on. And so one method that we use to achieve that is the lean startup methodology, where you try and come up with an approach that achieves the very core idea of your goal, but in the simplest possible way, but in a way that allows you to get feedback from the users that you're going to be giving it to. So then from that you can then iterate, and then build up. So instead of building this huge monolithic system like this, which would cost an enormous amount of money, and you don't even know if it's going to work or not, or whether people would use it, you approach it in a different way, and you come in from the bottom, find out the minimum possible thing, and then start building up from that.
Yeah, I recently learned that MVP does not stand for most valuable player,
Yeah.
but rather minimum viable product. So it's now a term that's been ingrained in my mind for the last several months.
Yeah.
So, and it's a really hard concept, I think, for us to grasp, because we all tend to be somewhat perfectionists. And so, what is that thing that you can put out there that really is the minimal experience that you can then get response on and then build upon? And I think that's really a very hard shift for museums to make, because we're used to sort of thinking through all the details and putting this sort of beautifully crafted thing out there and say, now experience this.
Yeah.
And so, getting to that state of, well, we know this is where we want to end up, but maybe that's not the first thing we release, is really an interesting and challenging thing to do. Yeah.
It's really risky, because you are revealing to your audience that maybe you have many additional iterations to go, and you are revealing to some degree.
No, I don't think I agree with that. I mean, I don't think your audience is going to notice that, frankly. I mean,
Or the staff might feel that way, whether the audience notices or not.
Yeah, but I think we need to get over that. I mean, what's interesting about MVP is it allows you the opportunity to basically see, like directly observe behavior patterns that you might not have expected, and then possibly pivot.
Yeah.
Maybe entirely,
Yeah.
you maybe, well, we started out as a drawing app, and it turns out nobody was doing that, but
Yeah.
everybody loved the camera thing that we had on
Yeah.
there, and so maybe we should think about that. I mean, I always think at the Denver Art Museum, we had a mobile app that was not designed for tablet use, like to run it on an iPad, you had to blow it up, and it looked horrible, and it was a really unpleasant experience. But we found that elderly visitors were using the app on those tablets because they had tablets because they Skype with their grandkids. So it was a behavior pattern that we had not expected and could not have possibly planned for. And if we built a bigger, fuller thing, we couldn't have taken advantage of that knowledge,
It's about being
because
able
we
to
would have
react
already
to things,
exhausted all of
yeah,
our
isn't it?
resources in building this other thing that nobody wanted.
Yeah.
But at what point did you get to it where you were like, this is a really awful thing, and then pivot? Because once you've invested a certain amount of resources and time and got
Oh, actually, you've got a thing here. I think you can maybe use that. Does that work? Oh. No.
But once you've invested a certain amount of time, resources, effort, money, buy-in, when do you scrap that and say, I'm going to actually do something more risky? I think that time timing is really, really critical. Because if you don't take advantage of it soon enough, then everyone sees, like, they get frustrated and you lose that momentum.
Well, I think you have to define what risky is and what risk means in this context. I mean, there's reputational risk, which is, I think, mostly illusory. I think we're, as museum people, I think we're far more conscious of that risk than I think our audience is. But then I think there's also the sort of sunk cost fallacy, which is like, okay, we spent a lot of money building this thing that no one's using, but we spent a lot of money on it, so we should keep spending money on it, as opposed to saying, well, time to rethink that.
Right, that's called escalation of investment. The idea that if you're sitting through a really terrible movie, that the longer you sit there, the less likely you are to stop watching it. I've now invested like a full hour of my life into this. I may as well get through to the end, and we tolerate really unpleasant experiences because of this. But this is the same reason that we don't abandon failed projects when they start to show signs of failure.
But I think that's why it's important to kind of break these big projects into much smaller pieces and define, okay, what is the minimal thing that we can live with, so that we can, you haven't committed to that. You're not an hour and 15 into the movie, but you're, 20 minutes in, and you still have an opportunity to rethink. Because, so I think we've all seen or been involved with projects that at the end you're like, well, that was great, but, it's not really kind of going where we needed to, or that it's changed so much in the process, but, you're already down a path that you can't change it at the last minute because, but so much of what you know about the project has changed along the way. So I think what we're just saying is accounting for the ability to change and learn from what you are putting out there along the way. And I think that's just
Part of the process of working in the interactive space and working with mobile, period, is iterative. And that's, of course, on the inside. So you're working through the content, you're creating a build, you're going through QA, you're releasing a beta. You might be testing that, but just with staff or, an inside group. Possibly you've got some visitors, but then you're going through an alpha and a release. And that might be a traditional model. And then if you're really thinking of an ongoing iterative process, then you're building this in stages and the release in stages. And I think it's pretty important to, as a team, bring all your stakeholders together and walk through that process and do it in a number of ways. It's not just through a schedule and through a budget, but it's really talking about who you're bringing in at the various different phases, and then being able to create comfort with stretching that out and revealing the process. Because as I think you're saying, if it's about reputation, that's more inferred internally, but you really do need to get buy-in. And you need to plan for the cost. I think the cost of bringing in evaluation, the cost of a release being a staged release.
But and to your point about bringing the team together, I think this notion of a third space means that there are lots of people in a lot of different areas that you wouldn't necessarily bring to the table. Traditionally you wouldn't have brought them to the table right at the beginning, but you're going to need networking, you're going to need hardware support, you're going to need finance, you're going to need education, curator, like you're going to need all these people at the table because they all have to be invested in it, because it is about these connections of the different kinds of experiences, and each of those roles has sort of ownership of a piece of that.
To speak to that, if you give us permission to fail from the very beginning, then that's great. But as a contractor, your mandate is to not fail. It's to do your goddamn job, do really well. So if you're told or given permission almost to, take some risks, if it doesn't work, then that's all right. We can have that time to pivot and find something better. But, you go into it in this mindset that I'm going to make something work right out the gate, and then you have to just follow through with that. But if everyone gets on the same page at the very beginning, that this could totally suck, but we're okay with that, that would go a long way.
I think it's interesting also that we're kind of inferring that an MVP is something inferior and not finished, but that is definitely not. It's just something that's much more focused and doesn't have a fully featured feature set, but is something that you can get in front of people, you test with them, find out what you're going to do next, basically. Yeah.
And you've been doing a lot of that with the sort of the full-scale prototyping and things like that too, right?
Yeah. Then, but you just have to have the actual audience. You just have to have the actual audience that you're using. So for us, when we do a lot of prototyping, you can bring in a select group, but it also shifts their mindset as to what they're doing. So your results sometimes get skewed. So if we had permission within a museum to maybe mess with somebody's experience, help their experience, to further testing, that would be really helpful. But yeah, there's a limited amount you can do without that, okay, that you can really fuck it up.
Well, and we're well underway to be in the Cursonist panel at MW2014. Yeah, we did discuss this ahead of time.
Really 2 points.
It's Friday morning.
I forget who it was that said this. I wish I remember because it's the most brilliant thing when he said, failure is what we used to just call research, and but I think that points to kind of a big problem is that I think we have a certain fear of failure, which really, I think if we thought about it in a different way, I think really what we're talking about is, mobile projects should be research-based because we don't really understand them that well. It sort of feels like we do, but we don't. We don't really know how these things behave in the world, and there's so many variables that it's hard to really know how any one thing is going to behave. So, I feel like in many ways, mobile projects should mostly be research and testing, and then sort of like the last 10% is the product. Yeah.
So we're going to open for one question, and then we'll move.
Okay. I wanted to just point out and also ask this question, which is that I think a lot of times when we talk about failure, we're thinking about things that don't work, that the technology maybe isn't functioning the way that we wanted to, but there's also this other level of failure, which is you've created something that's so super cool, everybody wants to do it, and everyone's crowding in a space and having their digital experience, or maybe is not paying as much attention to the exhibition as they are to the interpretation, or whatever that is, that's a level of failure that should also be taken into consideration. And those are the kind of user behaviors that we just don't know until you get the thing out there and in people's hands. So I just wondered if any of you had that experience where that really affected.
I have one, which is that, we launched this camera piece of the app. It was so popular, it caused some technical issues, let's just say. So we actually had to make the decision to take it out of the experience for a while until we actually figured out where the problem was, and this is where this connection becomes more challenging, because we couldn't figure out whether it was the Wi-Fi, the network, the app itself, the iOS, or some connection in between. So we really had to kind of get in there and figure it out. It turned out it was the iOS, by the way. It was one of those things where in all of our testing, it didn't come out because we didn't have the load. And so we had the load. And it's a great problem to have because it's suddenly the thing that you've built, it becomes more popular. But then you also have to deal with the repercussions of that. So, I guess sometimes you just have to say, hang on, we'll be back, pull the curtain, and then go fix it, and then come back again.
All right, we're going to hold it for the after, but Steph, you'll be first.
I was just going to add to Allegra's.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, is there a microphone? I was going to say another example. I work at MoMA.
Maybe stand.
You want me to stand?
Yeah,
Oh,
please
here's the microphone.
Getting ready for karaoke tonight. Okay.
Hold up, we got to get the spotlight ready.
Okay. I was just going to add to Allegra's. Another example of that is we found, the app once it was in operation, once it was being distributed. We found that some of the changes that we had to make some changes in order for the distribution to go more smoothly. So, for example, initially we had the language localization. You had to go into the settings, and that became very burdensome for the checkout desk. And so we had to go report that back to Allegra's team, and then we spent a week or so to actually change the way that the language was changed, so that you didn't have to back out of the app and go into settings. You could do it within the app. So that's just another example of how when you take this MVP approach, I think it actually helps you to solve a lot of real world problems that you wouldn't otherwise be able to.
Okay, so we're moving on to Tim.
So as probably a lot of you know, SFMOMA is currently closed for a major expansion, and we reopen in 2 years from now. So it's difficult to talk with any specificity about a mobile strategy or implementation, because we are, I'm kind of thinking we're squarely between the future and the past right now. Too early to talk about what a mobile implementation there will look like in 2016, and too late to talk about the past implementation from before we closed. When we last revamped and reinvented our in-house mobile experience, that was 4 years ago in 2010, and the clear model, our clear point of departure was the audio tour. And so we knew that we had to meet the expectations of the person coming expecting an audio tour, and of course the app could provide more than that, but as long as it met those basic expectations, so this is what I'm calling the mobile expectations. You know, we know that now, I mean, we're just a few years ahead of that, and we know that the number one thing that our visitors want to do with their mobile devices is take pictures. They take pictures of themselves, of each other, of the artwork sometimes, of the architecture. And, but there's a question of, does this change the way we think of that, the sort of the model for our mobile offerings? Do we need to own this experience? Or, I mean, do we need to own that behavior? Now, so one analogy, and I'm going to use lots of analogies because I don't have, we don't have a concrete application to talk about. So you'll bear with my metaphors, please. I thought about, say when you're preparing to go, as you prepared for this trip, when you're packing, presuming you came from somewhere else, you probably didn't pack bed linens or towels or pillows. There are certain things that we simply expect will be adequate, provided and adequate for our needs. You probably did pack a toothbrush. And you could, I mean, of course you could choose. You could forget to bring your toothbrush, and you can go to the front desk and ask for one, and they will provide it, right? But no, like, how many of you do that? So there are certain, these things all have their analogs in mobile media. You have, we know that we're very particular about the tools that we use for, say, taking pictures, for tweeting, for sharing, for managing our social media behavior. And so those I think of as the toothbrushes. They're really personal. People get accustomed to one. They sort of, they feel, these things feel adaptable to, or adapted to our needs, to our behaviors. And so, then the question is, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what are the linens and the towels? Like, what are the things that the museum is responsible for providing, and how do they dovetail with the self-sufficient, with the largely self-sufficient mobile user? So we want to acknowledge these, and observe the behaviors, the mobile expectations of our visitors, and we need to accommodate, but not necessarily own, take ownership of those behaviors. So now, the other analogy that comes up, and that I've talked to the panel about, is the Swiss Army knife principle, which is that a tool that tries to do everything tends to do everything less well. So if you, the reason it's crucial for us to decide, what is the thing, what is the experience that we're offering, and not try to say, well, it can do a little bit of this and it can do a little bit of that. You can't say it's going to be a smart car and an SUV, and we really have to decide. And so that's kind of the question that I am pondering and asking everybody to think about is really what, how do we anticipate the user's mobile expectations, and how does what we provide actually augment and fortify and integrate with those mobile expectations and those and the self-sufficient mobile user.
I like the linen pillow analogy. And is in your case, if people are coming in and they are fairly self-sufficient, they're bringing their own toothbrushes, is the linen and the pillows the infrastructure around that? Is it the decent Wi-Fi that in the building? Is it the good wayfinding, whether it's physical or within your app, within what experience you provide, so people can find information very quickly and then do whatever they do around that information? It feels like that's a good service that you could offer off the bat, and then having provided those basics, observing what people do with that raw material, and then moving on from there.
Right, and I think that it's going to be different for everybody. But I would say that in our case, that's going to be ubiquitous Wi-Fi, a permissive photography policy.
Right.
Those are central building blocks. Whether you provide the devices, this is a question that I think it's still too soon to answer. But do you hand people a mobile device if they want one? Yeah. And then in the past, if we had this conversation a few years back, we were only doing that. We were only providing the devices, and there was no downloadable version for your own device. And certainly, that's certainly not going to be true moving forward. But there's an open question as to whether do we provide devices? So there are a bunch of questions, and I think there's no, certainly there are no singular answers to these things. Like each museum has to decide, like, what's my responsibility to provide to the mobile user?
But I think there is that question of, we think of ourselves as individual museums, but visitors think of us as museums. So is there an expectation? I go to this museum, I should be able to get this base level. I go to this museum, I should be able to get the same base level, and then there's variety built upon that. Like, or is it just a hodgepodge? Like, I think that's kind of a question. We're always looking at it from our individual points of view, but visitors are looking at us like, oh, okay, I go to the museum, I expect there's a gift shop, I expect that there's a restaurant or cafe. Do I expect that there's a mobile tour? Do I expect that it has wayfinding in addition to audio? Like, what is my expectation of that experience?
Well, what's interesting about that to me is in a way I feel like we can make that decision now. I think if we all keep making the same apps, we'll create an expectation that all museums will have the same apps. In a way, if we kind of, if we just sort of freak out a little bit more and each do wildly different things, like we don't create that expectation. I don't know, that's wildly speculative. Sorry, goddamn speculative. Yeah.
Only 1 point. It's only one.
At best, 1 point, yeah.
At best. But that also brings up the idea of if one museum is doing something really well with a mobile application, why would you want to do something completely different and discard that? So build upon what people are doing damn well and do it even better.
Fucking right. That's like 4 points, right?
That's okay.
That's 4 points?
Hey, I'm not playing your game. Just okay. Yeah. All right. There's a question.
Yeah, I wonder
If
you look at what people are, their expectations for mobile offerings, are you also rethinking other resources within the museum? For instance, those guys in the suits who tell you to stay behind the lines, can they do something else or more if people are relying on the mobile devices for some things? Does that change the equation at all?
Yeah,
but also, I mean, because people in museums don't just see them as security guards. They want directions. They want different things from them. And if the mobile device is doing some stuff, can they do some stuff that's different?
I actually have a story about that. So with the Artlands application at the Cleveland Museum of Art, there is a function, which I'll get to ultimately, where you can scan objects. And what anecdotally we found is the security guards are so helpful with groups of people who are doing it, that they'll sometimes take pictures of people scanning objects. Yeah. It's a very popular phenomenon. And it's kind of like, well, they're guarding the art, so they shouldn't be engaging on that level, but their participation has been invaluable to promoting that.
Just real quick, in response to the question, we did a pilot a year ago with a group of what we're calling gallery hosts, and their function is somewhere between a docent and a guard. So they did have security guard training, and then they also were, but they were selected for their knowledge of art interpretation, and they also carried iPads with certain media on them relevant to what was on view. So that performed a number of, it addresses a number of problems, but one of the things it does is it makes people aware that there is media, that this media does exist, and that you can actually go online and find all of it, but most people are unaware of it. And most, our digital offerings are often very invisible, and you have to be savvy to actually know it exists or how to find it.
Okay, so I just have a relatively quick question. It won't take me long to get through this, but in talking with the rest of the panelists for this panel, it sort of came to me that in many ways, like what we're often talking about is sort of how do we get more information into the user's hands? How do we get more content out to them? And what I'm interested in is, and Emily, I think, is here from Getty. I'm curious to hear about y'all's project, which I don't know what it is, but it might be relevant here. I'm curious as to, are there other types of experiences that are not necessarily information-based that we can use to reinterpret both objects and physical spaces? So, thinking about, is there a way that we can use mobile devices to make the physical space much more of a variable rather than a constant? So, thinking about using elements like, sound, color, light, even thinking about using 3D projection mapping on walls to eliminate the sort of white cube approach. Are there things that we can do with mobile devices that will fundamentally change the visitor's experience and fundamentally, cause them to reinterpret works in different ways, other than simply just putting information in their hand, basically giving you label copy or whatever it is on a mobile device. So,
yes.
I'll stop there.
I think it's a really interesting point, and I think the things I would find difficult to answer would be how you would stop one person's experience interfering with someone else, or is the intention that the experience is designed that you're kind of you're not directly controlling the environment, but you're kind of like influencing it in some way and changing it. You're kind of saying like, I wish it was more like this, and you can kind of push it in one direction and then get to achieve that, or can we just turn the lights off and no one can see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's probably sort of up to the individual institution. Certainly, if I imagine mobile devices influencing that sort of behavior, it seems like it would have to be some sort of collective action or averaging out of behaviors. I think, probably one of the most interesting examples of that would be Halsey Bergen's Roundware platform, which, what was the name of the piece? Scapes, at the De Cordova, where it was, you would move around, you would leave little, vocal things that you would say, and it was all kind of put together into this collective experience that was really interesting.
I have a thought and then kind of a question. One thought is what you're describing in some ways makes me think about the root of what we think of interpretation in the mobile sense, which is audio, and just how sometimes just a simple soundscape can be really a transportative experience when you're looking at a piece of art or when you're contemplating an idea, and that can be in a lot of different ways. But I guess my other question is what you've pointed out, and I know that Halsey Burgundy piece, that's really kind of a commission by an artist, if you will. It's almost an art piece in and of itself, and how what you have laid out is somewhat esoteric, and I'm wondering if you can tease out for us some of the practical ways that this might transpire in a museum environment where it's not either just selecting some sort of additional media like audio, where it's not an artist's piece in and of itself. Sort of what else can an institution do with a mobile experience in this way that kind of changes your viewing?
That's a really great question.
You had some examples to share with us on the preliminary calls.
I have some poor ideas about it. I mean, even at just a simple level, like there are certain things that we've come to expect in the online experience that we don't yet expect in the physical space that I think we could. For instance, like I think about iTunes right now using ambient backgrounds where it'll draw the most dominant color out of, an album art and then basically fill your screen with that color. Like just imagining going into a museum space and instead of, image on a white wall, it's like suddenly that wall takes on some, dominant color or something like that. I mean, and there's any number of reasons why that might be a terrible idea. But, what's interesting to me about that is we now have the capability to think about that space in a different way that I don't think we could before. I think this might be a good time to hear from Emily because I'm out of ideas.
Sure. How do you know about this project?
Sweet.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So at the Getty, we're doing some work. I'm fortunate to work with a group of gallery educators. And we're doing some work right now to develop, it's really in the very early stages, so not kidding. But we are trying to do something experiential and building a way to engage visitors in the gallery without giving them any information at all, asking them to do something. And so literally, find this work of art, get down on your hands and knees and look at it. Find this work of art, stand in front of it for 2 minutes and be quiet. Find this work of art, imagine you're an ant crawling on the surface of the fruit. What do you see?
Was
what do you
this
smell?
app created by Yoko Ono?
Right. Well, I mean, I think what we're trying to do is that this work is, first of all, it's already happening with our gallery educators, but it's also really important ways that people connect with the artwork already. These are things that parents do with their children when they're standing in front of the work of art. And so I feel like this, for me, is taking a step back from the curatorial voice and the voice of the museum as like handing down information on high, and giving people actually a toolkit for how to interact, that then they can take that experience and apply it somewhere else. So I'll be presenting on this in 2016, so I'd love to have you all come to my session.
Awesome. I guess we have time for a question. Loic. You got to wait for the mic. God damn it.
Just on, I think there's a lot of space for this kind of thing, like the non-information type mobile experience. And I feel there are a number of projects out there. I think of Take Trumps as a great example of a project where all it was just fighting with artwork. They didn't really give much content, and it was incredibly creative. I think Conquer the Museum as well, the National Museum of Scotland project, I encourage people to have a look at as well, where people had to answer questions to kind of take over museum spaces. So I think, but this space is much more risky to try and invent something which works. I'm sure there are as many failures as there are successes, but I think there's a lot of potential there. I feel that's kind of the exciting space for us to create frameworks to engage without that information part. If people want the information, then great. But creating an engagement, just some kind of personal inspiration, I think there's loads of room there.
Well, and I think what's interesting to me about it is that it takes advantage of something that's very unique to museums, which is, we're interpretive institutions, but we have physical spaces where that interpretation can play out. So, yeah, I think it's in a way, it's something that maybe only we can do, which is really fascinating to me. And I think with that, I'm done. Thanks.
Well, that I can just keep going in the interest of time. And I'll do it from here. The examples that I can share with you are speaking directly to that. They are functionalities that make people look at the space itself and root them with the artwork. So with the art lens, the image there, you can scan it. It physically makes people look at the artwork. They appreciate it. They get some content, but mostly it forces them to look at it and puts them in that physical space. Often helped by security guards, but it does happen. It then creates a unique experience for them with that artwork that is, I guess, more in line with what you would call traditional viewing experience. Let's see. The total times this has been used is over 121,000. And of that, 116 are on site. So you've got 116,000 times this has been used by people in the gallery. That's a powerful tool. But most importantly, it works very quickly. If it didn't work within 10 seconds, people would be frustrated and have a tendency to walk away from that. So using that information, we're now embarking on another project with the Tech Museum, where it's really a prototype first approach. That's all those lines in the drawing. It's using actual sensors that people have to stick all over their body. Sounds like it won't work, but we're lucky enough that the museum is totally on board with that approach and have actually offered up their members to be testers. I think there's also wine involved in this testing session, so that will go a long way to help us out. But we get to prototype this, and it actively makes people use tools to go throughout the entire museum. But if it doesn't work the first time around, we did build in some time to then adjust, correct, maybe there's less sensors. Most of the sensors are not exactly 100% working right now, but that comes with time and more process. So it's really, from a local projects perspective, building tools that keep people looking actively in the space itself, and using hardware and the technology available to support that, because image recognition wasn't around all the time, but now it is, so let's use it well.
What are the sensors sensing?
The heart rate, stress levels, a lot of the movement. So using the functionality inherent to an iPhone, which is the accelerometer, direction, footprint, path, literally anything that we can stick on you to sense what you're doing, we will. The EEG information, breath rate, all that, and then trying to create some semantic inferences from that as to what your experience is showing you. There's an earthquake exhibit at the museum, so one of the prompts is, how will you fare during an earthquake simulation? And then, that gets people to go look at the exhibit, but while also focusing on themselves. It's interesting.
I think what Keely's pointing out and what local projects do really stretch the limits with institutions, and the institutions who can think this broadly and maybe invest in this type of approach, and that what's really interesting that you're bringing up is about bringing it back to the physical space, and there are many ways of doing that too. One example I'm thinking about in particular that we're doing with Antenna is we're launching at the Frida Kahlo Museum on Tuesday a multimedia app, and one of the things that we are including is a multimedia feature that's a letter activity where you can select one of 3 letters that she wrote, and you can hear it read out by a character narrator. But then the audience is invited to just simply sit down in the courtyard and write a letter if they chose to Frida, stick it in an antique mailbox and mail it to the institution, who can then select it and put that letter up on Facebook or the website and create more of an audience. And there's lots of ways that multimedia and kind of the mobile experience, the app itself, can be more fulcrum. You know, it's a vehicle to exploring further, and maybe that exploration and that engagement is really analog. It's one approach.
It's also capitalizing on content that might be supportive of additional looking without necessarily distracting from. So, for example, in the scanning application, you've got videos that are provided to you after if you're forced to look closer at the actual artwork itself. So the path is look first and then learn, as opposed to just playing a video while you're in somewhat proximity to an artwork. You'll just watch the video. Jane was saying yesterday that some of the interactives in the gallery, people were asking, well, where's this object? Well, it's right in front of them, but they're so busy looking at a video or something on the screen that they're not seeing the work itself. So how do you avoid that? And so I think it's literally putting artwork first and then supporting that experience afterwards.
So we have time for a question or two if anyone's interested. Do we have a mic up in the front? Okay, do you want to stand?
Just tell me about this art. No. Thank you.
Project manager probably.
First, I want to correct something you said. 10 seconds is freaking too long, because remember when it was 6 seconds, we had to adjust it. So people have a 2-second moment of if it doesn't work, because we did have the phone, we rolled up the phone and it took too long. But my question is, I do believe you have to experiment, but you have to, whatever you experiment with, you have to sort of make sure that part works. So the experimentation comes with a new behavior. And even with the scanning, people were scanning the label because they were used to, it's so long ago technology, QR codes, right? So to everyone is, I think you should take calculated risks, but how do you do it when it's a new behavior, when it's a behavior that we think is going to catch on, but people don't know how to use it, and then we were testing and we were like, look, nobody knows that your device connects to the collection wall, so how is that going to even work? And so that's my question to all of you up there.
I mean, I guess that's, how it does go back to that kind of prototyping and testing with smaller things, but, and it is, having the members with the wine and trying things out. I remember that we, with the last app that we did, we had a user testing with members shortly before it launched, so it was pretty far along, but it was really useful both in terms of kind of confirming or, some things that we had decisions we had made, but also sort of thinking about future additions to make. But at the same time, it surfaced some things that were kind of like, oh, let's just go ahead and put that in there without realizing that how kind of important that would be. So what I'm thinking of is in our existing app, our previous app, it was art terms. People really like to have the art terms right there. And that was something, it was like, oh, it was easy to put in sort of, and it was almost a last minute thought. But with that testing, we found that was something that they really appreciated. So I think it's both learning what are the unexpected results of what you've put out there, but also sort of listening enough to kind of figure out what it is that where you can then take it. And it's hard with something, you know, I imagine it's very hard with something as large and complex as the wall, because you have to get to a certain point before you can, you know, really get people's understanding of what it is and how it interacts. But, you know, paper prototype, I mean, I know that you've been doing prototypes, so I think that that's really the only kind of way you can do it, is to build from paper to, you know, something very rough to something slightly more refined, to, you know, and just kind of keep scaling it up, because, you know, otherwise you kind of get to that, everything's, you know, connected and perfect, and then it's like, well, they don't actually get the whole experience. And so trying to avoid that by just bringing people in along the way. And in education, we have an interpretive fellow who's full-time in the education department, and I mean, it's been a godsend to have her on this project, because she'll just go down to the floor and interview 100 people about something, and you have that data, and it's like something you can then work with. And so to have somebody who's just focused on, you know, answering one or two specific questions when you need that question answered is very helpful, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, people help people.
Yeah.
So this
Yeah,
was-
that's what, I mean, at ours, it's the people helping each other, but my question was, I mean, I totally believe in prototyping, and I also was gonna say, when we have a budget, we take the equipment, we reuse the equipment, the final equipment, in prototyping for other activities. I mean, because we didn't have a prototyping budget. But it's more about, people will think things don't work because it's never been done before, and it catches on, so it's very hard to push people along saying, no, this is an activity that's my thing, because it could look like it's not going to catch on.
But
That-
Well, I
often
think
cases
that's-
it's just a small amount of orientation, just to nudge people and just seed an idea in the head, and as soon as they've got that, then they understand it, and they can use it perfectly happily. You know, so a lot of the time you can test stuff and test the actual interaction or the gesture or whatever it is that works really well, but they don't understand that it's there. So then you just give them that little bit of orientation, and then they're off and they can
I mean,
go.
or a lot of orientation. I mean, I think this is where your frontline staff, again, comes into play. Sorry, I know we got to wrap up, but I mean, in many ways, the promise of audio guides was always that it would replace your docent or whatever, and I think we still have that vestigial attitude that these things should work in isolation without assistance, and I don't know that necessarily has to be true, especially if you're trying to provoke new behavior that visitors aren't used to. I don't think there's any reason to not say this is behavior that needs to have somebody with you at the time kind of working you through it. I think that's okay.
I know that we probably have some additional conversations and questions that we could field, and we're just realizing that there is another session that starts right now. So we presenters will be right outside of these doors, and if people would like to further the conversation, we'll welcome that. Thank you so much.